Mitakulu. Let's start healing. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Murchison, and welcome to the Let's Start Healing podcast. I just said, how are you in Finnish? You know why? We have more in common than we think. And what we have in common can change the world. This is episode 30 of the Let's Start Healing podcast. Subscribe to our podcast. You can also listen to all of our episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and our podcast YouTube channel. This episode is brought to you in part by BE Decor's Interior Decorating and Styling Company, where interior decorator Lynetta Chanel Duncan will creatively personalize and style spaces in your home or office to complement your quality of life. BE Decor's specialty is creating living spaces, including she caves. Chanel Duncan's idea for she caves comes from her passion for helping women practice self-care. She caves are offered under the brand She Works, She Slays, She Caves. Visit BE Decors at bedecors.com. You can also find BE Decors on social media at BE Decors. Our guest today is Jaaz Jones, who was our guest on episode 3 of Let's Start Healing. And here she is back at episode 30. She was also on our Mother's episode back in September. Jaaz is a co-author of a wonderful new book called Women Who Illuminate, a collection of illuminating stories that will brighten your heart's journey. And Jaaz gets real. The book is published by Kate Butler Books. You will really enjoy this. This is available on Amazon, and it was #1 on Amazon when it came out at the end of August. Jaaz is co-founder of Mad Miracles Women's Empowerment Organization with her daughter, Genia Hale. In this episode today, she shares a little of what she writes about in the book, and she gets personal in talking about the profound impact that her late beloved mother's mental illness had on her. You're going to find it powerful. And she also discusses how she handled being a victim of violent experiences as a child. She talks about it in a way that we don't often hear. We both talk about things around violence, particularly about sexual violence. We don't always hear it discussed with some of the aspects that we talk about today. Jaaz is also going to be talking about spiritual practice and why that is so important. Also, a practice of mindfulness is so essential to our well-being. I am so happy and excited that she's here. So let's meet her. Let's get started and let's start healing. Welcome, Jaaz.
Thank you.
I am so happy that you are here once again, and it's an honor to talk to you about this beautiful, wonderful book, Women Who Illuminate, and 30 stories to illuminate your soul.
Yes.
And you are one of the featured authors, and you have a lengthy chapter titled Lessons from the Darkness for Living in the Light.
Yes, that's my story.
I love getting to know this deeper side of you. I've known you for, I think, about 10 years now, even though we had a period of time when we lost touch. You actually did a segment on a recent podcast where you had brought up your mom, and you shared a little bit about this book. And I hadn't realized how much your mother had shaped you to be who you are right now as a result of her mental health.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit. I mean, this is just amazing. We have similar relationships, or had similar relationships with our late mothers, in terms of, we adored them so much.
Right. I call our relationship, it's the yin yang, the crown or crucifier, the head and tail of the coin. It was all the extremes. I love and adored my mother, and my mother drove me crazy. All of the above, as we talk about with moms. But the distinction with my mother was growing up with a mom that suffered a nervous breakdown, dealt with mental illness, and who was also one of the most positive reinforcements in my life. But what that did for me is it gave me an aerial view, and it really instilled within me the power to choose. That was the big takeaway for me. And in my previous book, which we've talked about, In My Mother's Voice, in my opening, one of the things that I state is that my mother gave me a life preserver even when she was drowning. And to me, that's the best summation of my relationship with my mom, was that she's always been an encourager and a supporter, right, always blowing wind on my wings and lifting me and touting, you can do anything.
Right.
And at the same time would wake up in the morning one day and say, I can't take this anymore. I don't want to live. I want to end my life. And these extremities really gave me that sense of taking the aerial view and saying, I get to choose. What is it that I'm choosing for my life?
But how old were you when you were mature enough to do that? I mean, you were experiencing things as a child, as a young child.
And that was a part of the process. I believe that the divine, there were things that I was exposed to that helped to shape and mold me. From that first quote, when the pupil is ready, the teacher will appear. That exposure allowed me to see through a child's eyes, but there was a heart of wisdom that came with that.
It was kind of like you're experiencing and observing at the same time.
And I had no idea how it would shape and mold me. How we talk about when we ask God for patience, right, He doesn't make us patient, but He gives us the opportunity to exercise patience. And I remember Wayne Dyer was just one of my favorite mentors and followers. And in his book, Inspiration, Your Life is Calling, it was this aha moment. He was talking about his conversation with God, if you will, and that how we all have a contract before we come. And arriving to the planet, God, I want to be an inspiration to others, and whatever that is.
Yes.
That we get these opportunities that we're not aware of that help to shape that. I always knew that I wanted to inspire people ever since I could speak, doing stage and, just performing. And the interesting thing was I wanted to inspire others, not as much entertain. I love the entertainment side of it, but there was something else. I went into theater, loved theater, but there's another nuance. There's something else in terms of connecting with the audience beyond just performing.
Do you know what that is now? Do you know what it is that you want to
I'm an entertainer.
Yeah, an entertainer.
Yes, I'll entertain you, train you.
Do you know what the thing is that you want to remind people of or let them know? Is there like a message or... like in what way do you want to inspire them?
Oh, absolutely. It is to inspire others to see their story and recognize they're the storyteller.
Yes.
They don't have to be stuck in the story. We get to turn the page every single day of our life. And that was the lesson I learned with my mom. I saw where she got stuck in early chapters of her life. As a matter of fact, I was having a dialogue with my sister-in-law about that, and we were just talking about our early years and growing up and things that we came to recognize. And that was a lesson for me to learn. So when I made the reference, my mother threw me a life preserver. When I took the opportunity to take the aerial view and look at my mom's story.
Was she still living then, or had she passed?
Yes. This was part of the navigation of our relationship, and what allowed me, one, to not judge her condition and define her by it.
Was she bipolar or?
She was diagnosed, bipolar. Some manic depression, and there was a lot of experimentation going on. And so me, the naturalist, no drugs, energy work, I saw my mother being what I called a human guinea pig.
By her doctors?
Yes. Every experimental drug that came out. And I knew that that was impacting her body as well as her mental state, most definitely her body. And it really is what led me to do the work that I do, to become deeply involved in energy work, to deeply look at the alignment of spiritual work as well as our physical work and the mental work and how it all ties together. And I know that that was birthed from that curiosity and everything that came from my mom.
This is so enlightening and amazing for me because I get to see contrasts between us because we've had some of the same experiences. My mom, I don't know how to describe her. She was the strongest person I ever met and the most fragile person I ever met. She
Great definition. I would say the same.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even now, I don't know anybody for me who was stronger, who is stronger than my mother was.
Yes.
And there's things that I just absorbed from her. You know, I am her, I think. I definitely have her heart. No question I have her heart. And so I look at similarities. And so to see what you've taken and evolved from different circumstances in your life and the story, you brought that up, I think, very early on when we first met, because I remember us going to an art gallery in Beaufort. And there was this young woman who owned an art gallery, and she was talking to us. And for some reason, I just understood, like the light bulb went off. She's stuck in her story.
Yes.
As she was talking to us. And I'm sure you must have brought it up when we walked out. And from that point on, I was sort of mindful. I do get stuck in my story, but since then I've been mindful. Talk about the story. Like, you can't tell someone to get out of a story if
absolutely not. Absolutely not. And there's an expression, you can't see the dragon that swallowed you. And that's our story. And when we're stuck in our story, we don't see it because we're stuck in it.
Right.
And to tell someone they're stuck in their story only takes them in further. And when I look at the story, the very term that you just used is really the key, is mindfulness. And what happens when we're stuck in our story, we're stuck inside of our head.
Right.
And we certainly don't want to make ourselves wrong. And we get caught in this loop in our story. And it's our story becomes the reflection of all of the stories that are a part of our life. So when I talk about my mother's story, what was healing for me in our relationship was my ability, my practice. It became a practice of looking beyond my mother's story and seeing her. Just the woman. It's the foundation of the coaching program that we do, Mad Metamorphosis, because the first component is imagine a girl who. Before there was a label for it, an exercise, what I did in transition and transformation with my story with my mother, I went through this process of where we were very close and then we were very distant. It felt burdensome being responsible for my mother's mental health. That's what I took on.
Yeah.
My mother used to say to me when I was very young, as I was growing up, she would always call me her gift from heaven. And she would often say she believed that in another life that I was her parent, and in this life I was somewhat her parent. And I took on the role of learning from me.
That's something that she would say that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, when I was really young, I took it on. Like, yes.
Same.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because, it was this idea that, oh, my mother looks up to me. That's so awesome. And as I became a teenager, I didn't want that responsibility. I don't want to be responsible for making you feel better.
Yeah.
And she would say I was her reason for living. Well, at a very young age, that was awesome. Yes. Oh my gosh. I'm this awesome child and my mother looks up to me. And as the story progressed, I began to get resentful. I was like, I'm a kid. Let me be a kid. I don't want to hear your burdens. I don't want to take all of that on. And resentment built up. And the very thing that you said about your mom, oh my God, that so resonated with me, that my mother was the strongest person and the most fragile.
Right.
And I judged what I believed was that fragile part, that mental part. I remember saying to my mom, get over it. Snap out of it. You get to choose. Depression, every holiday story, every holiday, I could time it like clockwork. My mother would go through these states of depression every holiday, every December. And that story was created out of the story that her father died when she was 5, and it was around Christmas time. Her mother, when she went into the sanitarium with tuberculosis, went around the holiday. And then later on, her brother died around Christmas time. She started linking the story of death to the holidays and planned on being depressed.
Yeah.
Like, well, here it is. It's December 1st. I think it's time to get depressed. What I didn't get in my naivete was really understanding that, okay, this is a story, and it's just like what you just said. You can say, hey, you're stuck in a story, but that doesn't help a person. Emotionally, it doesn't do anything. It's like telling a child when they fall down, get up, you dummy.
Yeah.
That's where they are. How do we support in that process and not get pulled down on the ground? They're with them.
Right.
And my ability to detach and see it as a story is where the healing started happening. I thought about my mother's story. So the strongest woman that I knew, this was a woman who, as a little girl, her father died when she was 5. Her mom went into a sanitarium when she was 7 and then passed away at 11. She went from family member to family member, as she called it, going from pillow to post, was literally a self-made, self-raised child into a woman that I saw reading books like Think and Grow Rich. The library that I was introduced to transformed my life. The first book my mother ever read to me from, that is my favorite book to this day, that I speak of so often, is The Prophet by Khalil Gibran.
My favorite writer.
Oh, yes. So to have those kind of stories introduced in my life, what my mom helped me to see is, and when I say she threw me the life preserver, she was so enveloped. She was drowning by her story because she hadn't learned that practice of letting go of the past story, right? But she surrounded me with all of these wonderful stories that I got to choose the direction of the story I wanted to buy into. So when I looked at the story that she bought into, it helped me to alleviate the judgment of her and to imagine, if I was 5 years old and my dad died and then my mom, and I went through this process. My mother got married at the age of 15, not because she was wildly in love. She met a man who was 11, 12 years older than her, and that provided a home. She wanted a stable home. She imagined herself into a family, and to have the imagination of creating a family and creating love. And I allowed myself to see this girl navigate her life and always reaching for a better feeling thought, reaching to create a better world, and being raised by this single woman who not only had these challenges, but I saw my mother go into prison and transform young women in a program that she created. She was a director at a modeling school and in a program where she helped to transform young women and their lives and what they believed about themselves. And I'm witnessing this and I'm like, oh my God, yes, I want to be able to do that. And I witnessed her be able to do that. And at the same time, do that in the midst of her own struggle. But I wasn't in the center of that struggle. I was able to be the witness. So because of the witness and how I witnessed the story, I could repurpose it and navigate it in a whole different way.
Right. You said so much. You said so much. Listen, if my mom needed to be on my back, I wasn't happy to have her on my back, but I was
But you
happy
were willing.
I was happy and willing. Like a
Yes.
part of me is like, absolutely,
Yes.
whatever you need. But it is it does take a toll. It did take a toll. I remember watching this TV series. I think it was called Once and Again. It was about two divorced couples. And one of the moms, she was somebody that you would feel a connection to. You know, she was a beautiful, loving person. And she was having some emotional hurdles in getting over the divorce. And her daughter was a lot like me. Like, listen, lean on my shoulder. Let me take some of that emotional burden off you. You know, her daughter was a lot like that. But the mom started having a breakdown, and the daughter was going to the extreme and wanting to help her emotionally. And the father, who's now the ex-husband, had to come in and say, that's not her job. And I mean, I started crying because I was like, no, it's not your job.
Right.
You know, like as much as I was honored and would do it again in a heartbeat, all the different things, it's not your job. Your job is to be a child.
Right. Exactly.
The parent's job is to be a parent.
Well, that's interesting that you say that. And for me, that's where freedom comes, because what happens is the story, we get stuck in these labels and identifications of, quote, what our job is. And our job, part of my release, and this came from The Power. And I paraphrased it to fit my own dynamic. In The Power, written by Rhonda Byrne, who wrote The Secret. Mm-hmm. And this became my mantra. My job is to love as much as possible every day. That's my job. Everything else is a label,
right,
that creates an attachment. And we create labels for mother, father, sister, daughter, husband, wife, whatever
and
those
roles.
labels are. Right.
And roles.
Right. So those labels, those
depending
roles,
on where you are in the family, and
that it has to be a certain way. And when it's not that way, it goes against the story. And we have this breakdown and this conflict around it. And what I recognized was when I replaced what my job was as a daughter, that my job was to love as much as possible every day, that I did that.
Yeah.
And in doing that, there were some challenges along the way. Yes, absolutely. But getting outside of the label, and I recognized in becoming a wife and becoming a mother that nobody could define that for me but me, even though those who I am being that role for have their own story about what it's supposed to be.
Right.
And that's what I mean when I say it's so easy to get stuck in these stories based upon stories that we were born into, stories that we got attached to. There's all of these stories.
Well,
that
because
are going
we
on.
start believing, we make a judgment about ourselves.
Right.
And you said something that was really helpful. So I think we both believe spiritually that we can change our minds about something. I'm not 100% successful with that, but I do understand that I can change my mind about things. And it's not always easy to do. And that's something that I think that you're very powerful in, changing your mind. That's what you're talking about. You said something to me that helps to change your mind is imagine the situation differently.
Right.
Because
it's a story.
Because, you know, sometimes exactly. Sometimes, I mean, I could be sitting here and the fact is this, the fact is that, I'm experiencing this, I'm experiencing that, and I need to change my mind. I need to make a different choice if I want to change this dynamic. However, it's not so easy for me to do that. But if I start imagining,
Right.
if I start using my imagination, come up with a different visual, that's movement.
Absolutely. And one of the words that you just used that's so powerful that we get stuck in are facts, and the distinction between truth and fact. Truth is changeless. Facts are born out of story. Every fact is a story. And I'll use the example, especially as we look at where we are in our world, politically, emotionally, and what's taking place. It's a fact that slavery existed. It's not a truth. It's a fact, right? During the time of slavery, slavery was a fact, but it was acted out as a truth. We confuse facts and truth because truth is changeless.
Were you saying it was acted out as a truth? Explain what you mean.
And what I mean is that it's true, and so it is. It is that. That's the way the world is. It's a fact that people used to believe that the world was flat.
Right.
And they act as if it was a fact, but it was based on a story. It wasn't the truth.
Right.
we later, but guess what? The world never changed.
Right.
It's always been, that's the truth, right? But we will take a story and make a fact based on that story and live it like it's the truth.
And that happens with history
all the time.
I mean, historians even acknowledge that.
Exactly. Well, guess what? We are her story. Her story, how we live it. We live out these facts based upon these stories like it is the truth. And when we can step outside of the facts that we've created or we have bought into and see the story around it, we can navigate. And that's what I mean when I talk about the ability to change our mind, because we operate as if our feelings run us, right?
Right.
Like depression, that's an emotion, right? We start tapping into these emotions and these feelings as though they're a fact.
Exactly.
But
it's
they
just
come
the
from
way,
our thoughts.
It's just the way we feel.
Exactly.
Right.
And we say, but you don't understand. This anger that I'm feeling, it is the truth. I can justify it. I can tell you why. Let me tell you the facts.
Right.
Let me tell you what happened. I have every right to be angry. I have every right to be upset. Yeah, you do. And how's it working for you?
Yeah, there's oh my gosh, I'm drawing such a blank. I can do this differently. What's the guy's name? Hale Dwoskin? He says something like, if you waited for your feelings to change your mind, you would never change your mind.
Exactly.
And I was like, wow, that's like really true.
Well, we're always talking about the Course in Miracles. And even in the Course in Miracles, it says, I can choose peace instead of this. And it's talking about choosing peace instead of the thoughts. Peace is how we feel.
Right.
It's a feeling.
Right.
I can reach for a better feeling thought. And I believe that that's really what our stories are here to teach us. It is our ability to get outside of the story. And so, as you know, when we were talking about women who illuminate, that came about in terms of me looking at where am I in my story, and to tell the truth about where I am, but not be defined by that.
And so where are you?
Well, I'm going to go from the point of Women Who Illuminate. When I was asked by the publisher to be a part of this book, I was in this transitionary period of looking at my story of what's working, what's not working, where am I? And out of a practice, I practice looking at my ego, not being stuck in it.
Yeah.
My she-go, as I like to refer to her. And I also recognize, aerial view, the true me, the essence of me, seeing me stuck in my she-go. Because it happens, right? And that's where I was. And I was navigating this. And I'm being asked to write on Women Who Illuminate. And for me to write about illuminating, I had to recognize the dark place where the light was provided, where there was some light shining in to find my way. And
at that time.
Right. And so when I say where am I? From a place of wanting to support and inspire others to live in the light, right? I do not believe that I could be authentic and talk about how my life is illuminated and not talk about the darkness.
Right.
So but I was experiencing this moment of self-judgment.
About self-judgment about where you were
just
at
about
that
my
moment.
Life. Yeah.
Okay.
Being asked to write this, shining the light on myself, saying, well, you could actually be a little brighter over here, be illuminating a little bit more,
Yeah.
looking at every area. I looked at business, I looked at my relationship, and as bright as they all are, it wasn't me looking and saying, oh, everything is crap. It was me looking and saying, I'm so blessed. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the life that I live. I'm grateful for the wonderful people that are a part of my life. I'm just grateful. And that's where it starts. It starts with the gratitude. And for me, gratitude is the light.
Right.
That when I am stuck in self-judgment, it's because I'm not being grateful. And that's what I mean when I say, okay, what's the she-go judging here, right? Because wherever there is judgment, there is no gratitude.
Right.
Where there is gratitude, there's no judgment.
Right. And where there's judgment, we've made a decision.
Exactly.
We've gone into a place where we made a decision and we're in a space of we're not happy with the decision that we made.
And it's a story.
Yeah.
It's
a story that we told ourselves.
Story.
Yeah.
Right? And so when I started writing this, I got out of, quote, what do I want? What's the story that I want to tell? And I ask myself, what's the story that I'm living? Not necessarily the same thing, right? Rather than writing from this perspective of, okay, you guys, let me tell you the story of my life. Who cares?
Well, there's some deep stuff in here.
What's in there is not what it started out to be. And my chapter was actually birthed out of a walk that I took with my daughter, Genia. I had already sent her some copy over, read this, tell me what you think. And she gave me feedback. And I love my daughter because she's authentic and she's honest. And she'll say, this is nice, Mom. And you might want to consider it. And you got a little into the story. I'm like, oh yeah, I did. And as we were walking, it poured out of me. And what I recognized, and it's a default button, is I recognized the darkness that I didn't want to look at. So I could look at, where am I shining? Where am I illuminating, right? Well, where am I illuminating? If all I'm doing is looking at my illumination and not looking at where that dark side is, I'm not learning that lesson in the dark, right? What's the darkness? Because I believe that our darkness comes to teach us a lesson so that we can shine our light. That to me that's the story of living. That's the story of our life, is what is the darkness here to teach me so that my light might shine? Because the light always shines brighter up against the darkness.
Right. And I think for me personally, do you feel this way? I think for me, it's an opportunity to trust. And that's not easy. It's certainly a process for me. But I think, when I'm feeling darkness, it's an opportunity for me to trust.
Exactly. And trusting, that's a part of the practice, right? I always go back to, what's the practice? Again, lesson learned from my mom, out of the observation and not the judgment. And I would ask her, what are you practicing here? Because I would watch my mother practice depression. And I am not making light of
practicing depression.
Yes. And I'm not making light of mental illness. I understand. I lived with it and through it. But I also recognize what we practice is what we live. That is what we end up creating. And when I talked about the library, that my mother had some of the most phenomenal books, and a lot of them that she never read. And then I started looking at the ones that she was reading. She studied depression. She studied bipolar. She practiced depression. And so when I talk about people getting stuck in our story, we start practicing areas that aren't good for us, but it becomes a practice.
So folks understand, we do have to look at what we're experiencing.
Absolutely.
And so getting stuck in our story is not ignoring what we've experienced.
Not at all.
So
it's witnessing it. That's the distinction. Rather than judging what we've experienced, because that's what gets us stuck in the story, the practice of getting outside of our thoughts. I always say, are you out of your mind? If you're not, that's the best place to be, right? So getting outside to become the neutral witness. Let me just witness the story that I've created. No judgment here, because out of the story, we establish a set of habits. Talking about practices, our practice forms habits. My mother had a habit of being depressed. Trust is a place of allowance, and that's the gift that we give to ourselves and others.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges of getting unstuck from the story is the resistance. We resist it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I don't want this. Oh, this is awful. Right. When we release the resistance, it's like unblocking the flow of water, right?
Right.
You know, because our story, if you think of it like a river that it gets dammed up, right? And then we have all of this buildup. When we release the dam, we allow it to flow. And our resistance is the dam that keeps that story right there, locked up. Whereas when we just release it,
and we don't realize it, and it's easy to not understand that
Right.
until you experience it.
Right.
It's 1,000% true. You have a story that you bring up in your chapter about a dream that you had related to what you just said that I want you to share.
Oh, yes. The dream was about riding a bike, and it came at a very pivotal time in my life. When my mom passed away, I was the executor of her estate, had challenges and some issues regarding her property. And so I had this dream the night before I was going to court regarding her property. And like I said, I had been paying the bills, and it was a nightmare. It was me holding on, right? This is the last thing I'm holding on here. And in the dream, I'm riding a bike. One of my favorite things to do. And it's this beautiful spring day, riding, and it's beautiful trees along the side. And I'm taking it all in. And in an instant, I'm going downhill rapidly and feeling the breeze, but almost instantly I go from riding the bike and going down this hill to going into this dark pool of water. And everything is black and dark. And as I'm descending into this water, I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? I'm in the water. I'm holding on to the bike with my right hand, and I'm stroking with my left hand. And it's exhausting trying to drag this bike along in nothing but darkness. And I pause, and I'm like treading, and I'm holding on to the bike, and I look up, and I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? Voice of God, spirit, I hear a voice say, let go of the bike. Now, you may laugh, but I looked at it and I was like, that's my life. That's my life. Let go of the bike. It's such a simple answer, right? Just let it go. It's not serving you anymore. And that dream became like this soliloquy of my life. I stepped back and I looked at what I was dealing with respect to my mom's property and everything that was going on. And it was like, let it go. That's not your mom.
Yeah.
It's time to let go. And I used that dream as a point of examination around the story of my life. So out of the story, there's these habits. I had the habit, the bike, it was mine. It was like, ooh, right? So there's our habits, the influences, and the thoughts, all of that makes up what happens in our life. And what I said was, there was a point when riding the bike that it was serving me really well, right? It was edifying my life. It was adding to my health and wellness. But the very thing that was serving me was becoming the death of me now that I'm in the pool. And it's the examination of life that I use. It's what became the foundation, a part of the teaching from a coaching perspective of taking that examination. So you mentioned earlier about changing our thoughts, right? Like changing our mind. Imagine your thoughts is the bike.
Right.
Here I am. I'm on this bike. Now, when the thoughts are serving, ooh, I'm doing well and I'm doing really good. But those thoughts that start to creep in, that are suffocating our life, that are limiting us from our growth and development, it's time to let them go. And it's so easy to say. right?
Right.
But why would anybody be stuck if it was easy to do? Well, you just let it go. That's what practicing is about. That's the practice of meditation. That's the practice of reaching for a better feeling thought. That's the practice of breath work. That's the practice of connecting with nature. Is that when I invoke a practice, what I do is I eliminate the limiting belief or thought, because energy, love, energy, and space says two things can't occupy the same space at the same time. Rather than focusing on what's wrong, like I want to get rid of, because as soon as I say, I want to eliminate the negative thought, what's the top of mind? The negative thought. Law of replacement said, oh, I want to feel energetic. I want to feel lively. I want to feel joyful. I'll go for a walk. When I walk, I feel happy. When I walk, I feel exhilarated. Whatever that is, as you begin to replace, it's not the elimination you're putting your attention on.
Right.
It's the replacement.
Right.
And that's really what the shift of the reaching for better feeling thoughts. That's the shift of changing our feeling by changing our thought with replacement. What am I replacing it with?
And you have some, not only with your mom, you have like some real experiences. You bring up being sexually molested in this chapter. And I remember asking you years ago, and I didn't understand your response until later, as I evolved. But I wanted to know how is this not impacting you now emotionally? How did you let it go? And you had said something like, I just did. Something like that. And I was like, huh? Like I just didn't see.
I can choose peace instead of this.
Exactly. So,
It's
I mean,
choosing.
the way that, our conversation, I don't want folks to think that you haven't been through it. You've been down in the trenches, you
Yes.
know, and, you're talking about real things that you came through.
Right. Because stuff happens in life, right? I love Jack Canfield has this formula called E+R=O. The event is the event. I can't change the fact that I was molested, right? And what we focus on is changing the outcome. But I want it to be different. That's where we get stuck, is I want a different outcome. What we have control over is how we respond to it.
Right.
That's what I changed. And so it doesn't matter what the event is. I don't care if it's molestation, if it's bankruptcy, if it's death, whatever it is, the events occur. And when we take responsibility for our life, it doesn't mean that, oh, let me take responsibility for creating this event. Let me take responsibility for this man who physically abused me, right? That's not what it's saying. Taking 100% responsibility is about how I respond to it.
You did not, or don't at this time, have shame around that.
Absolutely
And
not.
so, but that's a common thing
It
to
is.
feel.
It is.
So did you ever feel that, and that was a process in letting go, or it was just, that's not a part of your makeup?
It was a practice. Again, it goes back to the practice. Now, I will tell you there were two very specific instances in my life of molestation that were impactful. And one was at the age of 6 being molested by my babysitter's boyfriend, who's a 66-year-old man. And the interesting dynamic of that is at 6 years old, I didn't have everybody else's story, right?
Right.
The facts were I was asleep. This man came in my room while I was sleeping. I had laryngitis and other kids were outside playing. And he came in my room and I woke up with this man's head between my legs. That's what happened, right? I woke up feeling frightened. It startled me, first of all, right? And then he put his hand over my mouth so I wouldn't scream. Now and the reason I'm being descriptive to saying this is what's taking place, because we lump in the story of like, oh my God, he took my innocence and all that. That's story in that. Here's the fact. The fact is, I woke up, a man's head was between my legs. He was performing oral sex on me. I'm 6 years old. I'd never I didn't even know how to define that. I didn't know what that was. All I knew was that my body is my body, right? It was feeling a sensation that I hadn't felt before. And here's where shame, and this is why I describe that,
Absolutely.
right? Because we're told we shouldn't feel.
Exactly.
Right? But at 6, because I didn't have definition around it, I just felt what I felt. I didn't have a definition of right or wrong or good or bad. There was a feeling. The frightening part was him putting his hand around my throat to keep me from raising up, right? And so I knew internally, this is not, quote, right.
Right.
My body was still feeling a physical sensation.
Right.
And the reason that I know that I didn't take on shame around that is because my body was just doing what I wasn't telling myself, oh, this feels good. Or my body felt a sensation. I was able to distinguish between me and my body.
That is a blessing.
It is.
That is a gift.
That was a gift.
That is a gift and a blessing. I was in my 30s. I remember it was in the 90s, and I was watching an Oprah episode, and she was talking about sexual molestation and the whole thing. And exactly this came up about the body and the feelings. And that had never occurred to me, because that's where the shame is. You're not mature enough if you're a child to think, oh, you're taking away my innocence. You're not that mature to say that. But what you do feel is, this is my fault. I must be participating in this if my body is reacting. And I feel shame around that, when there's no shame to be felt around that. That should be felt around that, because you're a human being. The body's going to react to, things, stimulation.
Exactly.
So,
and like I said, because there were two very distinctive situations when I looked at that, and that being a gift.
That's amazing.
As vivid as you and I sitting here together, I remember the moment, and I remember the trying to raise up and to push against, and the struggle. And I talked to myself in my head, and I said, he thinks he's hurting me, but he doesn't know this is my body. It's not me. I remember saying those words to myself at 6 years old, that I knew that later it was like, that was a download. That was a gift,
right?
To have the distinction between the essence of me and my body. And I said to myself, stop fighting and just stop resisting, and he'll stop. And I did. I just went limp. I just laid there. And as soon as I did, it's like as I was talking to myself, that my words were entering him.
Right.
And, and he was drunk at the time, and it was like he got up, and it was like shook it off and got up, and he walked out of the room. He just stopped and he walked out of the room. Now, fast forward, the breakdown for me, after that, the police were called, and police came, and it became this chaos. And here I am, this 6-year-old child, witnessing the chaos of this few moments that was like, oh my God, all of this created all of that, right? And that's where the story begins. I ended up going to court. And the most devastating thing out of all of that was not being molested by him, but witnessing my mother having a nervous breakdown in the courtroom. My mother broke down and started crying and screaming, and, oh, my baby, how could he hurt my baby? And at that moment, I went into this defensive mode. As I said, I was my mother's protector, right? And I was like, oh, he hurt my mother. I didn't even process it was an act against me. I'm like, this man made my mom go into this breakdown. And
is this the situation we were saying that he said, oh, you're not going to say anything?
Well, no, my mom remarried a few months after that. And the man that she remarried was in the courtroom with us. And unbeknownst to my mother, when my mom married him, he later started molesting me. That's where it was really more of the mental challenge. That's what I carried for years and didn't heal from until I had a conversation with my mother, because my stepfather proceeded to molest me over a period of months. And he would always say to me, this is between you and I, and you can't tell your mother because you know she'll have a nervous breakdown. I remembered my mom having that breakdown in the courtroom, and I was willing to do anything to protect my mother's well-being. And it wasn't until, he attempted to penetrate me, and I told his daughter. Matter of fact, we had twin beds. I would crawl in bed with her after they tuck us in. and I'd sleep against the wall because he would have to wake her to get to me.
Right.
And then,
The things we do.
Oh, yeah. And so,
Yeah,
now here I am. Now I'm 7 years old, and I'm like thinking, how do I keep this man from getting to me? Ultimately, I tell his daughter what's going on. And I said, I have something I want to tell you, but you can't tell my mom. When I told her, she said, you have to tell your mom, and I'm going to make you do it right now because your mother needs to know.
Was she older or same age?
She's 3 years older than me. Yeah. So at the time, I'm 7, she's 11. 10. And we go into the kitchen one Saturday morning to tell my mom. And my mom literally stopped what she was doing, poured a cup of coffee, and just sat at the table and didn't say a word. We didn't know what to do. It was like, okay, well, let's just go outside. We went outside by our pool. And while we were outside, my stepfather returned, and I am now hearing all of this yelling and screaming. Later, my uncle comes over and he picks me up, but they're carrying my mother out on a stretcher.
My goodness.
And they have her locked in these ropes, and my mom is screaming to the top of her lungs. And as I am running upstairs, I don't even claim him, but the man she was married to at the time leaned down. And he said, I told you this was happening. This is your fault. So I'm 7, and he and my mother separated. And
you carried that.
My mother used to brag to her friends about how strong her daughter is and how I nurtured her back to health after her breakdown. Because when my mother came home, it was just the two of us. I paid the bills. I'd go and I learned how to write checks, and I literally was my mother's caretaker. And though I loved her, it was also out of guilt. So that guilt, that shame that I was carrying, I felt responsible for my mother's breakdown. And honey, that was at 7. I thought I created that breakdown. It wasn't until I was 32 years old. I am sitting at the pool with my mom, and a lot of stuff happens around the pool. My 2 children are in the water playing, and my mom looked over at me, and we were just in this deep conversation.
Yeah.
And she said, you have always been my rock and my strength. And she talked about how I got her through her breakdown. And I finally had to say, I just have to tell you, as much as I loved you, that was my guilt. She said, guilt for what? And I told her that carrying the responsibility of being responsible for her breakdown, I had been carrying that all those years. And she said, you didn't have nothing to do with my breakdown. My mother didn't even remember any of that. She mentally had blocked it all out.
What didn't she remember?
My mother didn't remember the fact that I was standing. She did not remember me coming into the kitchen telling her that this man had been molesting me and that the breakdown happened after that. He came home. They had an argument, and an argument infused, but she didn't remember the sequence of events and what happened.
Was she aware?
Because she blocked it out.
Was she aware that he had molested you, or she didn't have a memory of that ever?
No,
again?
She was aware later just because of our conversations. She was aware of the molestation. As a matter of fact, his daughter wanted to come and live with us, and that was a whole other story. But she was aware of the molestation. What she was unaware of was the sequence of event and how she found out. And she was unaware of the fact that I was holding myself responsible for her breakdown. And that's why when I talk about the power of the story and everything that evolves out of that, it was finally freeing myself from that story and telling my mother, let me tell you why I was there as your caretaker, because I felt responsible. That was almost 30 years, 26 years after that took place that I finally said, let me tell you why I was nursing you. And we can get stuck in a story and we don't recognize how that story runs the foreground, not just the background. It runs the foreground of our life. And my sharing that story allowed me to turn the page and start a new chapter.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, before we close, thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so
I always
much.
just feel like we get together and it's just a sister girl connection. I'm like, oh, wow. Are we recording? Oh, my gosh, this is an interview.
I know. I just want you to quickly go into the acronym of SHIT.
Okay. So the acronym of SHIT is, let me tell you what I do. People ask me, well, what is it that you do? I help people shift their shit. That's my job in life. I'm here to help you shift your shit. And your shit it's your stories. It's your habits. It's your influences, and ultimately it's your thoughts. And when we can just get a hold of the fact that there's this story that's been running in the background that I've been living in my foreground. What are the habits that have come? What are the habits that I've established? Habits like hiding out, procrastinating, whatever it is, we look at these little habits and we just say, oh, well, that's the way I am.
Right.
But it came out of a story. And then what are the influences? Our influences either infect us or they're inspiring us. So that was the process that I went through in terms of when I mentioned about my mom, and I'm like, what are you being influenced by? What are you reading?
Right.
What are you listening to? That's what you're pouring in. That's what is influencing that. And ultimately, all of that stems from the thoughts. So we shift our shit by shifting our stories, our habits, our influences, and our thoughts. And it's a formula. It's a formula of creating new practices. And that to me is the joy that's come out of all of this. And when I shift this shit, I am able to create a new story and actually a new chapter, because guess what? There's nothing wrong with any of the story. The story is powerful. All of our stories are powerful because they created us. It's what got us here. But now how do we shift it in such a manner that we're empowered by it?
Right. Because it's over, for one thing.
It's over.
It's over. Right. But I think what's good too is if a person feels overwhelmed, to just ask themselves, what is the story that I'm telling myself?
What is the
just
story I'm
that.
telling myself?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, thank you, Jaaz.
Thank you, Adrienne. And I just do want to share with everybody that can go to madmiracles.com to check out our book, Women Who Illuminate. It's put out by Kate Butler Books, and it can be purchased on Amazon. And we have some upcoming book signings that will be coming up, here in the Atlanta area for you Atlanta folks, and the Atlanta release is November 24th. But if you'll go to our website at madmiracles.com, engagements and dates and releases will all be posted there.
Okay. If someone wants to email you, can they do that?
Absolutely. Email me at madmiracles@gmail.com.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Remember, all of our episodes are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and our podcast YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and send me that email at letstarthealingpodcast@gmail.com. Let's start healing.